Speaker. Honorable Senators, the very first school for girls opened its doors in Afghanistan about a century ago, and the women in Afghanistan were given the right to vote in 2019, years before the women in UK. By 1991, 7,000 women were enrolled in higher education, 230,000 girls were attending school, 190 women were professors, and 22,000 women taught in schools across the country. On a personal note, I always loved visiting Kabul. Men and women coexisted side by side without gendered rules or prejudice. Women wore Western attire and owned businesses. I fondly remember my favorite sidewalk cafe, Khyber, was owned by a woman. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 led to 10 years of civil war, and with it intense discrimination and violence against Afghan women as the military strategy to repress insurgency. Sadly, the Taliban regime that followed only further served to strip women and girls of their human rights. For example, by 2001, girls had stopped attending schools altogether. However, Afghan women and girls are resilient. I would like to take a moment to share with you the story of one such Pushtun woman. And those of you who know the history of that region know that Pushtun women are fearless and warriors. And I think some of you might know one who sits with you in the chamber. This Pushtun young woman, Malala of Maiwand, was the daughter of the shepherd, and she was born in 1860. On the day of the battle against the British, Malala, as a woman would in those days, they would support the fighters by tending to the wounded, providing water, and supplying guns. As she saw that the Pushtun fighters were losing heart, she took off her veil, and taking off the veil in our Pushtun culture has a lot of significance, but that's a story for another day. And she shouted, "Young love," because her fiancé was one of the fighters. She said, "Young love, if you do not fall in the battle of Maiwand, by God, someone is saving you as a symbol of shame." This gave new resolve to the fighters, and when the flag bearer was struck down, it was once again Malala who made a flag out of her veil and led the men into battle. Although they emerged victorious, Malala lost her life on the battlefield. She was just 19. And the day of the Battle of Maiwand was meant to be her wedding day. Honorable Senators, just to give you a bit of history, that region, that surrounding area in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, has seen 60 wars in the past 300 years. That means a war every 5 years. So similarly, by 2021, the women had secured nearly 30% of the seats in Parliament. They were represented by a Ministry of Women's Affairs, and laws were put in place to protect their human rights. For example, women were finally able to include their name on their children's birth certificates and identifications, and violence against women was a crime. Women were making gains once again, and Canada was actively working to empower Afghan women and girls through training and grants. And yet, they lost everything once again 2 years ago when the Taliban took over the country. Their first order of business was to order women to stay at home, justifying this act of gender apartheid as a safety measure, as their foot soldiers were, and here I quote, "not familiar with seeing women outside the house and were not trained to respect women," end of quote. Afghan women's rights have been stripped away, every new edict further erasing them from a society they helped build. Since the Taliban have issued 80 edicts, 54 directly targeting women and girls who are now essentially confined to their homes, being unable to work or visit parks, gyms, and public bathing houses, or even attend school beyond the 6th grade. There have been reports of sharp increase in Afghan women taking their own lives rather than live in the shadows without any hope for the future. And as I was getting ready to speak, I heard yesterday, it was reported, that women who face gender violence are being put in prison, supposedly for their safety. I mean, how bad can it be? So colleagues, we're witnessing the complete erasure of women and girls in Afghanistan, and I worry that if we do not act now, this will only embolden other countries where women's rights are silently and progressively being rolled back. In its silence, Canada is complicit. Therefore, I call upon the Canadian government to recognize the situation in Afghanistan as gender apartheid.